Chapter 3, Genre Part 2. Now let's talk about secondary genres. I had to start by explaining genres and saying we can only pick one, our global genre. And that's absolutely true. We have to have one genre and one value driving all the core conventions and obligatory moments of our story. But also, if I didn't say that up front, Shawn and every other StoryGrid certified editor would come to my house with torches and pitchforks because this is the hardest thing to get us, free-spirited, my story is a unique and precious unicorn, writers to decide. However, once we have made that decision, we can talk about our secondary genre. This is where we can weave another genre into our story and give our reader a fuller, more rounded experience. Our global story may be a crime story that is turning on justice versus injustice, or a worldview story that is turning on naivete versus wisdom. However, we could also give our crime story a worldview secondary genre to see our protagonist grow during her pursuit of justice. For example, The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie by Alan Bradley. Or give our worldview story a crime secondary genre so our story has more intrigue to increase the narrative drive. For example, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is not to say our story must have a secondary genre. If we read James Bond novels, action, these are straightforward life and death stories. Same for the classic Sherlock Holmes stories, crime, which are strictly about justice and injustice. However, if we are telling a war story where our character is also shifting internally from naive to sophisticated, we are telling a story with a secondary genre of worldview. In most cases, we will want to pair an external genre, action, horror, crime, Western or Eastern, war, thriller, society, love, performance, with an internal genre, worldview, morality, or status. We can have a story such as The Great Gatsby, which is a global worldview genre with a love secondary genre. We can also have Pride and Prejudice, a global love genre with a secondary worldview genre. Just as our global genre has a specific value at stake and conventions and obligatory moments, so does our secondary genre. By splitting my thinking between global genre and secondary genre, it allows me to understand what is happening with my story at different places. When I was writing The Threshing, a global action story with a worldview secondary genre, some moments things were happening externally, moments the life or death value was at stake for my character. In other moments, things were happening for my character internally. She was having to confront her own internal shortcomings and grow beyond them. Again, we can approach this conversation through the lens of objects of desire. Often our global and secondary genres create competing conscious and unconscious wants and needs inside of our characters. The protagonist may consciously want to be with the man who is the love of her life, love. But she also unconsciously needs to shed her naivete and gain some wisdom in order for that to happen, worldview. The old detective consciously wants to figure out who killed the shop owner, crime. But in order to succeed, he unconsciously needs to face his own failure to do the right thing in the past, morality. However, and I can't stress this enough, the major shifts in our story must involve our global genre. Our secondary genre always takes a backseat to the global. As we move into the specific tools of StoryGrid, we will keep coming back to this idea of our global versus secondary and our internal versus external genres. At this point, we've talked about genre twice and are getting a sense for the conventions and obligatory moments we need to identify for our story. This gives us some language around the content of our story. But what is all this talk about the value at stake? We can see that action is about life and death. But how does that apply in the on-the-ground writing of our story? Now we have to talk about value shifts.